Good morning to you all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Jason Levine, and welcome to part 3 of this continuing series on how to make good videos great with audio. And today we're going to focus on some sort of last steps, finishing off your audio for video. I'm going to do a little bit of mixer automation, talking about using Audition as your sound design tool if you're doing any kind of sound effects, sound design, Foley, or anything like that. And how can you can use some of the techniques that I showed you in last week's episode to kind of really take advantage of some very cool sound design capabilities that we have there, as well as the ability to automate your mixes using an external controller or just automating parameters within an effect to create, again, better sound design and better sort of a better listening experience when watching your video. All right, so we're going to start actually in Audition, but I wanted to well, let me rephrase that. We're going to start working on sound design in Audition, but I wanted to begin here, actually start properly in Premiere first, because one of the things that we'll come back to a little bit later is one of the concepts that we talked about in last week's episode as well, which is the ability to send your entire sequence from Premiere Pro to Audition, which you can now really do largely as a full finishing workflow for two reasons. One, because everything that you've done, mixed, modified, affected, automated in Premiere will non-destructively carry over to Audition, so you can make changes. It's all fully editable. Also, you just have a little bit more, you have more analysis capabilities, you have more tools kind of at your disposal in Audition, and it's just a little bit more elegant for doing your final audio mix, and you can also publish directly to Media Encoder without having to send any kind of pre-mixed, pre-comped, stereo or 5.1 master file back to Premiere. You can actually finish it now on the Audition side. The way that you get your mixes from Premiere to Audition are simply to select the sequence in question, and once again we're revisiting my Something's Happening faux movie trailer that I built with my colleague Michael Shez. And you're going to go up to the Edit menu, Edit in Adobe Audition, Sequence. And you've seen this before, I'm just showing you again. You give it a name. You can send the entire sequence or just the work area. Video you will send via dynamic link, which means that, again, the video is not rendered. It's non-destructive. So if you were to change something on the video side and click back to Audition, you'll see it update in Audition as well. This is very, very efficient because, again, you don't have to wait for anything to render here. This process is very fast, and we'll do this a little bit later. Audio clip and track effects, they can all transfer if you want them to. And again, that's the setting I would recommend because that keeps everything non-destructive. Everything can be changed. You have the option to render clips with non-transferable effects. Just render everything or remove everything as well. So we give you all those options there. Pan and volume information, again, that's referencing any kind of keyframed pan or volume envelopes that you've drawn on clips in Premiere. All of that will be sent over non-destructively. And then you tell it to open it in Audition. Now, this particular version of this project is in Surround, so we'll come back to this a little bit later when I talk about surround automation, and again, kind of showcasing some of the differences between Premiere's automation capabilities and just surround mixing and auditions. But I've already sent over the original stereo version of this session to Audition here because I want to start talking about sound design and largely about sort of mixing and automation. If you're not familiar with what mixing and automation are, this is really the ability to obviously make every track of your audio, when we're talking about sound design and music, have some kind of movement. If you just have everything kind of set at a level, right, -6, -2, -3, whatever, and everything just plays back, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But you'll find, particularly when you watch movie trailers, certainly when you watch proper films, and when you listen to music or watch, any kind of like music video, the idea of having things kind of go in and out, move in and out, affects, expanding the size of a room via a reverb effect, or changing the amount or the volume of some very tense sounding strings during a frightening scene. All of these things are done via automation. You're changing parameters, you're changing values over time. As important as that is for color grading, right? You often have to change and modify. That's why they refer to it as color timing. The same concept applies in audio, and it'll make your visual appear that much more dynamic when the audio effectively follows and kind of, again, has its own movement, its own special presence that just accentuates things as you're watching them on screen. So we're going to pay attention to using some very simple techniques to do that. And I'm largely focused on working around automating volume and pan and some effects parameters as well. So let's take a quick listen. Again, this is the actual raw session that I created with all of the sound design for this very short trailer. Take a quick listen and look, and here we go. Okay. All right. So again, when you listen to that and you're watching it, you can feel that there's just parts of the music, those crescendoed, ascending strings, even that ending sound of that, all of these things are moving over time. And it's that movement that gives the soundtrack kind of that extra that really makes the video shine. And that ultimately is what you're trying to do with your audio for video, right? You're just trying to make the video look that much better, right? We spend a lot of time on proper composition and framing, and then of course color grading and color correction. But that final glue is really adding all of the sound and the sound design to kind of marry all those pieces together and to really make them solidified and just work nicely. So let's start breaking this down and take a look at what we've got here. And I think maybe we'll start with some of these ascending strings and focus a little bit on some very simple mixing automation, okay? So when I expand this track here, I can make this as big as I want. Typically when I work on these things, I actually usually make the track that I'm focused on really huge. The nice thing is you can do this right inside the timeline with a gesture. So you can see here as I do this. Now this is something which we've changed a little on the Premiere side. You now have to hold down the Shift key to do that, by the way, which some people loved. I know a couple people on my Twitter feed were like, oh, thank you, because it was very easy to accidentally start adjusting the height of all the tracks. You can also do this individually, of course, just by clicking and dragging at the top or bottom portions of any track. And you actually see the icon changes to these little, well, it changes a couple times there, but right, when you see this up-down arrow, that's allowing you to adjust the vertical height. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn off the effects here, and let's listen to what these strings actually are in their raw form. And in fact, why don't I just start by bringing us into the editing view, the waveform view, because here is where I took a very simple piece that I'd recorded on some virtual strings, which was this. Okay. And then from there, what I decided to do was to copy that bit and then using, so this is, again, we're kind of getting into sound design now, using one of our pitch effects. And in this case, I think I used stretch and pitch. You could use a number of these. I just started adjusting the pitch in semitones to kind of create this ascending kind of creepy sound. So from this single sample, copied 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8 times or whatever, I started highlighting those sections. Then here's what it sounds like after I applied each of those semitone pitch changes without changing duration, just changing pitch. Okay. And it has this kind of weird, creepy characteristic to it already. This is supposed to be scary. It's supposed to be horror. So when we listen to this inside of the multitrack just dry, obviously it's going to sound kind of bizarre. We need to dress it up a bit more. Now, one of the first things that I did with that was actually adjust the duration using our time stretch feature. Now, this is something which, if you're doing sound design, is so cool because, one, you can do it visually right inside the timeline. Incidentally, if you need to sort of move things against video, or you just want to sort of, while our video reference track doesn't show you thumbnails, which I wish it did, and maybe in a future release we'll see that. If you want to move tracks, by the way, it's as simple as you'll see as I hover over my mouse over sort of the top left-hand corner of the track. If I click and drag that and grab it, now you can see I'm able to move this up. So if I wanted to move this up to the top here, just below the video reference, I can drop it there, all right? And now I've got my ascending strings up at the top here. So one of the first things I did was actually time stretch this, because I knew that this had to last. This ascending string thing had to last from here all the way to here, all right? So how did I do that? Well, first and foremost, inside of Audition's multitrack, we have this function here called toggle global clip stretching. So you want to enable this function. And when you do that, what you'll see is that you'll now have these little white triangle handles in the extreme upper left and upper right corners of your audio file. And you'll see that down below here, it actually tells us the stretch percentage that's been implemented. Okay, pretty cool. So again, let's go ahead and just stretch this back to, I don't actually know what the original was. All right, something around this. Let's just say that this was our original here. This is 119%, but let's take a quick listen for a second. Okay, so obviously as you drag it out to maintain the pitch, right, it's gonna just slow things down a little bit. So when we go back to stretching it out to 198%, now again, without changing pitch, here's what it sounds like stretched basically like 2 times its original length. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, that sounds a little gritty. Well, it does. Now remember, this is meant to be used as an element. So the grit actually plays in our favor. And there's a couple of different effects and things that we can use to kind of mask some of those stretching artifacts. Now, before we even get to that, because this is a technical learning live stream, let me show you some of the options that you have. Now, we talked about this, a little bit of this last week. We're going to go into a bit more detail here today. So here, when you select your clip, if you go into your properties panel, now again, your panels will likely be docked in different places, or maybe they're not even open at all. You can always open the properties panel from up in the window menu here. Here inside the properties panel, you'll see that you have some stretching options. Now we are currently in the real-time stretching mode, which means that just as it says, we can click and drag this to fit any duration. We can snap it if we know it has to go from this marker to this marker. We can snap the duration so it's exactly what we want, and it's real time. We hit play and it just plays back. Now, your playback quality, depending upon how much you're stretching, may not be the best. That's just being real with you. It's real time. If you want a better sounding result, you can do a rendered version, but of course that's going to take, depending upon how long and how big the clip is, a little more time to actually render it out. Sometimes, to be honest, the difference isn't that great, depending upon the level and degree of stretching and what other advanced things you're doing. But want to point that out, that if it's really just sounding not quite right to you, try the rendered option here. And in fact, maybe if we do that, let's hear what this sounds like with the rendered option. I'm curious now. If it, again, at best, all it's going to do is take a little bit of that gritty edge off. Let's take a listen. And it really did. Okay, so let's take a listen again. This is actually really cool. Here's the real-time version. And you could actually hear it. Almost sounds like a sawtooth. There's like this little buzzing in there. When we go into the rendered version, and you'll see it happens very quickly. Granted, this is a fairly short clip to begin with. But we go into the rendered version, it just has that smoothness. All right, so you know what? I'm going to stick with rendered. It just sounds better. Like I said, the grit can still play in our favor, even though this is smoother now. What I'm going to show you will still work. You just have to try it out, okay? This is a short clip, so the rendered version works really nicely. Now, after that, you've got type of stretch. Now, this is where you're going to get your learn on, because this is super important and ultimately really determines the kind of stretching result that you're going to get. So you have monophonic and polyphonic. Monophonic meaning that it's a singular sound, a singular tone. So if we were stretching dialogue, voice, right? So let's say in somewhere in here, we'll get to this in a moment, I've got some voices that are, okay? And I wanted to take that and I wanted it to be, keep the pitch the same, but just drag it out. One voice, one tone, monophonic, right? Solo violin. Want to slow that down, speed it up? Single violin, single notes, monophonic. Now, one could say, but you can play, what if you're playing thirds or a chord, on a violin or a guitar or something like that? Well, once you're playing more than one note, more than one tone, you're now in the polyphonic space. Frankly, you can choose monophonic with a polyphonic source. You're just going to get a better stretch result by choosing these appropriately. And you just have to think, what is it, right? If you're taking a sound like a or a car horn or a siren or something like that, generally these are going to be considered monophonic sounds. Anytime you're adding more than one tone, it becomes polyphonic. Now, the idea between choosing mono or poly is twofold, because there's a couple of things that are unique to using these methods here. By nature, this is going to allow you to preserve pitch, but adjust duration without affecting pitch, just as you saw here. So as we stretched it out, right, our pitch never changed. I can stretch this out even further, right? Let's go to something like this and play it back. Now, again, it's because we're in the rendered mode, it's re-rendering here. If this were real time, we'd already be playing. So I might just take this off for rendered for that reason. But now when we play it back, again, the pitch has not changed. It should start somewhere around there. Okay, pitch is the same. Now, if you go to the other method, which is vari-speed, this now mimics a traditional tape style stretching, or rather tape style speed adjustment, where if you choose a vari-speed method and you stretch something out to, twice its length, what happens? Well, if it's taking longer to play that means that you've slowed it down, which means the pitch will change. Now, because we're doing almost exactly 200%, theoretically it would just be an octave lower. But that's the idea. With vari-speed, by default, your pitch is going to change, okay, based on your speed. If you drag it out, now we hit play. Okay, or if we were to take this and shrink it up, okay, so now we're at approximately 62%. The pitch is higher, okay? So vari-speed, by default, is going to mimic a tape style speed adjustment when adjusting length. Pitch will be affected. The other thing is that because this is actually doing a digital resample, the quality in rendered or real time is going to be very good. So that's one of the differences. Now, there are many times where you use vari-speed for that very reason. I don't care if the pitch is affected. Having said that, whether you use mono or poly, you'll notice you still have control over both. So you can do a duration adjustment without affecting pitch, or you can do a duration adjustment with affecting pitch. So if I wanted to take this and say, bump the whole thing up 4 semitones, all right? Now this is where having it in rendered mode gets annoying because it keeps having to render. Again, you'll get the idea. And I'm gonna take this off just now. Okay, because we just affected pitch, right? So you can do pitch and duration adjustment in both, right? So someone would say, well, then why would you ever use vari-speed? Well, it's a different sound, right? And for different types of sound design, you might be going for something. If you want to take here's a good example. If you want to take a drum track and you've got this scene that's very dramatic and you want the drums to be really like 1/4 speed. While you could do that with the polyphonic real-time or rendered stretch, sonically, depending upon how much you're adjusting the duration, that stretch algorithm may or may not sound great. It might sound okay. it might just sound a little odd. When you go into vary speed, there's some very dirty, if anyone ever worked in kind of the early days of digital sampling where you had sort of like the classic 12-bit samplers, all the Akai samplers from back in the day, all of which are sitting in front of me over here. It just gives you a very rich, fat, non-artifacted kind of sound because you're just slowing it down. You're not having to squeeze things in time. So, or speeding it up for that matter. So vary speed can really give you a very different kind of color when you're doing sound design. In this case, because I've got some other elements here, I'm going to leave this as polyphonic. We're not going to adjust pitch because I've already done my pitch adjustments here. I know what key I wanted it in, and we'll leave it alone. Now, just lastly here, under advanced, you'll see these defaults here, transient sensitivity and window size. I generally don't change these all that much. What this will do, particularly in real time and rendered modes, of course, is it's just going to look at, with regards to transient sensitivity, things like how it's affecting the attack, right? When you stretch things out without changing pitch, sometimes you might get what's known as a flam, right? So a flam is a da-da, da-da, da-da. It's actually closer together though, da-da, da-da. And sometimes you can get this weird, almost doubling effect. So by, and it depends what the sound is, increasing or decreasing window size and or transient sensitivity, you can often preserve some of those attacks that sometimes get smeared or just manipulated in a weird way via the stretching algorithm. Does that make sense? So it's kind of super technical, but it's one of those things where just, and this is how I'd recommend using it. Take it and, have a listen. So like we could listen to this. We're back in real time. So it's again, that gritty sound. Let's see what happens if we make the transient sensitivity 100% instead of 40. All right, let's take it back and listen again. All right, and let's adjust the window size too. Oh, see, now the window size is too big. So it's like you're hearing all the divisions of how it's trying to stretch. So in this case, we might want a much smaller window size. Notice those. You can hear it, right? With a larger window, you're actually hearing like. I'm doing this live. Yes, that's what sound design is. You have to be able to mimic the sounds that you're hearing. The window size is affecting those kind of divisions as it's trying to keep those notes the same pitch, but just elongate them. So just to give you an idea, we're kind of going to extremes to see how it affects and how it works. All right. And we'll just go back to kind of our defaults here. That's all of our parameters here inside of Stretch. Now let's now go into affecting this to actually modify and kind of really sweeten up this sound, which is also very, very dry at the moment. So when you have something like this that's kind of dry and gritty, and we want to preserve some of that grit, but also give it a bit more oomph, because it's also kind of thin sounding, what you might consider doing is adding something like a phaser, right? So a phaser is one of our delay-based effects. You'll find this if you look here under modulation, phaser. So here's where you'll find the phaser. Now again, phaser is a delay-based effect. Lots of parameters in here. If you've never worked with one before, just when you hear it, when you listen to it, you'll know exactly what it's doing. You'll see we've got a whole bunch of different presets in here as well, including things like Led Zeppelin, which I'm surprised. Oh, Zed Leplin, because of course I'm going, there's no way we put Led Zeppelin in there. That's a licensing issue. No, we just reversed the lettering. Your brain reads it however you want. Phase 80 instead of phase 90. That's in reference to the old MXR stomp box, of which I have one behind me. And the idea is this is going to give it that kind of swishy, swirly kind of sound, something a little bit like this. So I'll start playing it without the phaser, and then I'll turn it on and take a listen to what it's doing. All right. So you can hear it just kind of takes a little bit of that edge off. And what you can do with the phaser, I mean, you have so many various options here. intensity, depth, modulation rate, phase differential, upper frequency, the amount of feedback, and then of course your overall mix. Now I'm just going to quickly save this, JS1234, and just go to some of the other presets that we have here. So there's our Zed Leplin, 6 stages. Let's see, what's cartoon effect? Lo-fi phasing. This sounds like, actually, this sounds like what I was using with this. Okay, a lot of different options here, all right? And again, just to kind of take a little bit of that edge off and give it this kind of weird sound. Now, I don't want it to wow, 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 because I want it to sound like strings, all right? That landing lights one is okay, but I really like this lo-fi. Again, it took a little bit of that edge off and just kind of made it sound like, I don't even know what this is. I know it's strings, but there's this weird thing going on, and it's just interesting. Now that you've got that applied, how do we give it more space? Well, again, you can use a couple of different things here. Obviously, we could use reverb. For something like this, particularly based on the scene and how this is appearing, I wanted this to kind of build. And as it's building, I wanted it to kind of echo and delay over top of itself. So for that, I chose our analog delay. This is quite possibly frankly, one of my all-time favorite delay effects. Even out of VSTs and third-party ones, everyone who's watched me on here before knows I love Waves plugins. I have dozens of those, among many others. Softtube, I'm another big fan of Softtube plugins. But our native analog delay, and you'll see you've got 3 modes here, tape, tube, and analog, really sounds like old school analog delay. It's just got a very warm, dark, creepy characteristic. And as you increase the delays and increase the feedback, and what I love about this was actually licensed, I believe, from Isotope, maker of, again, many great plugins. We've got this thing here called trash. And what the trash setting does is this is what really makes this filter awesome, is that for each subsequent echo, it rolls off and basically degrades the echoed sound, largely by attenuating or softening the high-end information. This is exactly how classic tape delays worked. This is exactly why modern, like 80s, 90s era digital delays, I'm not a huge fan of, and many people weren't, because they would delay something and you'd hear it back like a digital copy with all the same frequencies, with all the same brightness, whatever. And it was just that. It was sort of bright and harsh. Tape, by nature, with each delay, would get a little bit darker, a little bit more, and then, just kind of dissipate into infinity. Not everybody always wants that. If that's what you're going for, the trash setting is going to do that. And you have to kind of use that in combination with feedback, because obviously feedback is the number of repeats that you have. So you need to have at least enough feedback for it to keep delaying so that you can actually hear those echoes, and the subsequent repeats get trashed, get sort of attenuated in their high frequency ranges. So take a listen to this. Now I've got this set at around 382 milliseconds, which isn't super long, but you'll hear what this starts to do. And notice that I have primarily a lot of wet signal here and very little dry signal. Again, this is a pretty common technique in sound design, because the dry signal we already know is, it's kind of flat. I kind of want this to feel like it's sort of going around your head. It's already going to be a little bit more swirly now because we have the phaser in there. The delay is just going to give it more of this sort of building and crescendo type sound. So take a listen once we've added the delay. Here we go. Okay, and did you hear those echoes? And each one was like, right? It went into this kind of creepy, dark place. Let's, while we're at it here, I think I'm going to do even a little bit more wet signal. And the spread, well, this is in stereo already, so let's make it even a little bit wider, okay? So now that we've got our delay on here, again, here's the before. Here Here's the after with our effects applied. And by the way, people ask this a lot because they use this technique in sound design a lot. What if you want those kind of never-ending repeats where it goes into that kind of feedback loop where it almost rings? Well, again, that's by adjusting the feedback slider here. Now, you got to be careful because you can wind up introducing a feedback loop, particularly if you have a lot of wet signal, right? So the more wet signal you have, and especially if there's wet and dry, it'll start feeding back on itself. So you got to be careful there. But let me show you. I'll try and adjust this and see if we can go into a kind of feedback loop here without making it go too nuts. Here we go. You've seen scenes in movies where you hear just that, right? It starts to build up. In fact, let's see if we can. It's too much because there's so much wet signal here. So again, now you can back this off a little and you can find that sweet spot. And that's like just enough, right, before it kind of hits that distortion, which is also, by the way, simulating overloading the sort of preamp input or the level in, trying to say, the input level to the analog or tape-based delay. So super cool, right? And if you want to create those classic late 60s, 70s echoplex or space echo effects, this is the effect to do it in, with the analog setting, feedback and trash in tow. Again, the more wet signal you have, the more you're going to have to be careful to not overdo those. But this is how you achieve those really cool kind of sounds. Okay, so now in context of everything, let's take a listen to what this sounds like. And I think this was actually at around -16 or so. So let's take a look. And what you can actually see is that it's using a combination. I've doubled, you can see ascend, double, and then I have another version of this ascending. So I've got 3 versions of the same thing, all kind of moving and crescendoing together so that it gets even bigger. Right. And notice too that this one ends here, so you just get the echoes. This one has already started to kick in, and then this one does a very sort of fast crescendo, and it sounds like that one just had a little bit of reverb. And in fact, it looks like it's got the phaser and some studio reverb on there. So no delay on that last one, and that's what gives us that kind of, like that very dramatic almost stop. If we take a listen again here, again, pay attention to this. Here, I'll go ahead and solo this by itself. Okay, and you can really hear that phaser in there. Right, and then add back in this ascending string. Now notice this one I kept totally dry. It just adds that creepy grittiness to it, and then add everything else back in. Okay, kind of builds to a nice crescendo there. All right, so that's a little bit on time stretching and using delay-based effects to create some sound design. Now, let's take another look at automation and automating different effects parameters, because one of the other things that we might do, and this is something which as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking that it kind of needs, is actually adjusting the volume of these 3 sliders as it's playing back. In other words, it needs to be even bigger for me. I want this to be even louder. So there's a couple of different ways that we can do this. The best way is to go into our mixer here. Now, I also happen to have this Faderport 8 here, which if I turn the camera on, you'll be able to see. All right, so here it is. And what I want to do is I want to, across these 3 faders, basically just increase the volume in that part of the scene. Now, because I can't see the waveforms here, I like to sometimes do this side by side. So I'm going to take this, I take this panel. I'm actually going to dock it next to itself like this. All right. Now, again, I don't actually need these faders here because I'm going to use them here. But this allows me now to see the waveforms, watch the video so that I can more accurately kind of increase the amplitude of these files, of these tracks, a little bit more dramatically. How do we go into automation mode? Well, the cool thing is that in this latest edition of Audition, if you're using a control surface, we now basically support every protocol out there. So, oh, here you can't see it because I've got the menu item on. So up at the top here under Preferences, Control Surface, if we go into Control Surface class, you'll see that I'm currently using the Mackie HUI, which is really the industry standard. This works with pretty much any device. Even Avid devices have some kind of HUI emulation. Now, if you want to add additional ones, you'll see that we also support Yukon. So this is the Avid artist controller. So all the Avid controller devices, fader devices, all use Yukon. This is the native one for my PreSonus Faderport here. We also do the standard Mackie control protocol. This is what Premiere still currently has. This is also somewhat standard, but not all devices support this. I've yet to see a device that doesn't support Mackie HUI, HUI, which stands for Human User Interface. And then this Red Rover is a native controller that we've had for Audition for years, that we used to sell in radio, which is kind of cool. It's a little red box for basically just doing transport automation and stuff like that. Okay, so I'm already set up to use this mixer, and what you can't see here, but there's a little screen, it actually shows me the names of all the tracks. So these 3 at the far end here represent these 3 right here. And you can't really see, they're stacked in exactly the same way. You can see this right here. So if you look up at the screen, you can see that their position on screen is basically the same. And because the mixer is tied to this, watch what happens if I actually move this fader here. Again, I've shown this before, but you see that the fader actually moves as I'm clicking and dragging the fader on screen. So this is a totally live, interactive sort of mixing experience here via this Mackie HUI emulation device, okay? So if we want to adjust volumes, now this is again affecting everything on the track over time, we can do that by going into these little automation sections here. And you'll see that we have 4 different modes: read, write, latch, and touch. We're going to go into write mode on these 3 faders. Now, this is one of the other benefits, or frankly, for my money, this is the main benefit for using an external controller, which is that you can move multiple faders simultaneously. Outside of sending everything to a submix or to a group or to a bus here in Audition, where you could have one fader controlling multiple things, there's really no other way via the mouse to move multiple faders simultaneously without having an external device like this. So this makes it really simple, really easy, very elegant to do that. So if we go into a write mode, let's go ahead and wind back here. And I'm going to just start increasing these ever so slightly as it's playing back. I'm going to start it from the top here. And you'll see the things moving on screen as I'm moving them here on the device. And then we'll play it back and take a listen. Here we go. Okay. Now that may not have been my most brilliant move, but you get the idea. Now you'll see once I stopped that, it now defaults to touch mode. Okay, this is the standard mode, which basically means that if I were to redo any of the automation that I just did, when I touch the fader, it begins overwriting. It does nothing until I touch the fader. And then when I'm done touching it, it'll go back to the last recorded position. Okay, this is very cool. If you want to say, kind of redo it all, but keep some existing stuff, but be able to have it stay when you let go, that is what the latch mode is for. right? So when you touch it and you move it, it will then latch on to the new point, right? So you might just think, well, isn't that basically like an overwrite? It is. So how do you sort of redo the whole thing? Well, you wouldn't do it in touch mode. You'd actually probably go back into write mode, and that will just overwrite everything. So write mode is a destructive mode. In other words, it's going to overwrite anything that you've done, regardless of, how you move and when you let go and touch again. Touch will allow you to make a change, but it'll, so a lot of times, like maybe you just want to bump something up for a second. All the automation was good, but you want to just bump it up for a quick moment. That's what touch is for. And then latch says, okay, when I move this, stay where I moved it even after I let go. All right. Now, when you look down into, this is another reason why I like having the mixer here, the side-by-side view. We might have to adjust our UI a little bit here. But in the track areas, and I'm going to expand these, you'll notice that here's your automation right here. All right. And then you'll notice a little triangle, a twirl down. And in this twirl down, here's where you can actually see the automation that we created via keyframes. Okay. And as I zoom in, you can actually see all the keyframes that were generated. Now, by the way, these keyframes are also interactive. So if I were to move this keyframe, do you see what's happening here as I'm dragging the keyframe? It's moving the fader for me as well. I'm like, I don't need that keyframe. Drag it off. It eliminates it. Fader snaps back. Okay. Now, we're going to get into a little bit of the technical settings here. In Audition, under Preferences, and I have to remember where it is. Is it multitrack? Yes. Okay. And you'll find this in Premiere Pro as well. And we'll go over there in a moment to talk about that. A couple of things that I want to point out if you're going to use any kind of automation, whether you're doing it track by track with a mouse or with keyboard shortcuts or with an external controller, is this thing here called auto match time and linear edit point thinning, and then your minimal time interval thinning. Okay, so your auto match time, 1 second. What that means is that, again, if you're in touch mode and you touch the fader and you move it, the auto match time is how long it takes for it to recover back to the last automated thing that you did. So 1 second is, it might be a little bit long. So, I might make this like half a second, or in some cases, maybe even, a quarter of a second, or in this case, a third of a second. Okay. So again, the auto match is the time it takes after you move something in touch mode, how long it takes before it recovers. Okay. Now, you will want this option, and I believe this is checked by default, linear edit point thinning. What is this? Well, again, as you're automating, remember, we're working here in 24 frames per second. We're also operating in 48,000 samples per second. So as you're moving, and we are in audio here, it's creating all of these keyframes. Now, you can imagine in a 3 to 7 second piece, it's hundreds, thousands, right? Thousands of changes over time. You don't want to see all of those thousands of changes. It's too granular. There's no point in that. There really isn't. I've never had an instance where I had to get so granular because, again, in terms of samples, you've got way more samples than you do frames, right? So think of it this way. Theoretically, you really only need maximum, and you wouldn't even want this many, 24 keyframes in a second duration. And that's already like too many, okay? So what linear edit point thinning does is it, first of all, after you automate, it looks at all the automation you did and goes, okay, let's thin this out. So instead of, this line that we see here, right? By default, this is probably 1,000 keyframes right there. But that's not editable. So it's going to thin that out by default. Now, the second thing here is the minimum time interval thinning. Because after it thins out the number of edit points there, then it is, okay, well, what's the minimum time between moves that we're going to show keyframes? And I think the default, because I didn't change this since the update, it may be 200 milliseconds. It might be 250. Faster, in other words, a faster interval, thinning interval, means that a shorter duration means you're going to see more keyframes. The longer you make this, you're going to see less keyframes. So if we put this minimum time interval thinning to, 500 milliseconds, which is half a second, you're going to see a lot fewer keyframes down here, which, again, frankly, probably makes things a little bit easier, depending upon what you're doing. you know, if you're swelling music in or sound effects in very slowly, that might work. It might be okay to have, instead of, you know, there's probably 20 keyframes here. Okay, so you'd have 7. That's probably enough. The curve will be the same. But you have to be careful of that, because obviously you can have too few, and then editing later means you're coming back over here and you're like manually adding keyframes. So just to point this out, those settings are very crucial. If you're seeing too many keyframes after you automate, just make this number higher. And like I said, I will typically recommend 200 to, yeah, you know, maybe 500, right? If you have your interval thinning to, you know, a second, 1,000 milliseconds, it's just not going to be enough keyframes, most likely, you know. So just something to keep in mind there. Okay. So now that we've automated an overall parameter, and by the way, we could do this for panning as well. So if we wanted to automate pan, basically anything in the channel strip here can be automated, including the actual state of the track, whether it's muted or playing back. Not solo, obviously. Solo is a function of actual mixing, not of the playback itself. You don't solo during a mix. So muting automation is not uncommon. Panning automation is not uncommon. All you have to do is be in touch or write mode, and you can start doing that. All right. And similarly, let's just go ahead and do that for a second here. Let's say that I wanted to do just that. I want to actually pan this. Here, I'll do this one just because we have a little bit more space here. All right, so I'm going to pan this one up at the top. Now, I don't know if I have my pan assigned here, so I'll actually do it on screen for a second. Here we go. Where are we? About 15 seconds. Okay. Okay, and if you were listening in headphones or on good speakers, you just heard me go side to side there. Again, wind it back. Hit play. Pay attention here to our little panner. Okay. It automated the pan. Now you might be saying to yourself, now wait a second though, where are your keyframes? I don't see the keyframes down here. Because obviously you have this whole editor down here. So you can see, first and foremost, you have this protect function, protect the parameter from being written when recording automation. Pretty awesome to have that. Very easy to accidentally overwrite. Obviously you've got your eraser to clear all your keyframes, and then you can set keyframes and then skip between them. But what here we want to focus on is, what parameter are we looking at currently? Well, we're looking at volume. We have the ability here to go into our show envelopes and then show any number of different things on this track. The asterisk is telling us that we've modified the state. And like I said before, remember muting on and off, very common in automation, right? So here it's telling us, oh, there's pan information. So if we enable the pan envelope, now you can see in blue, here's our panning state going from left to right. Okay, and it actually tells you left 61%, right 50% at this particular keyframe. And now you can see you've got more options to select. The selection here is basically showing you the active parameter so that you can edit those keyframes. Always get the follow-up question, can you edit multiple things simultaneously? Not in this view, no you cannot. Okay, and I think that's by design really, to keep it, because you'll notice as you start adding more and more, it can start to get pretty confusing. All right, now here's where again, you'll notice down below, show envelopes, you can see all the various parameters of the effects that have been applied. So like I was saying, this is where we can actually automate and change specific parameters of an effect over time as well, which is a really essential part and a very useful part of doing sound design in Audition, really, or anywhere for that matter, which is just modifying the processes over time. So what I wanted to do for that was adjust some reverb on this scream that we have in this section here. So let's see what we've got on here. All right. So I'm gonna solo this scream. And here you can see I've got a tube modeled compressor and some studio reverb applied. Let's go ahead and play this back. Okay. And you can hear that it kind of trails off. It's kind of subtle. But I really want that reverb to be, I want it to be big and echoey and just kind of linger there. So in this case, I actually want to manipulate the amount of decay, or perhaps the wet signal over time. So first, before I do anything, let me just hear what I want that sort of mass decay to be. And I'm thinking right now you can see it's at around 2,700 milliseconds, about 2.5 millisecond decay. And it's just not quite big enough at 44% wet. All right. So I'm thinking maybe we'll almost double this. Let's go to around 6,000. Right around there. Okay. But what I actually want to do is increase the decay and then increase that wet signal over time. So two different parameters I want to automate here. So maybe we start it at 2,700, and then by the time it gets to the end, I want to increase that decay amount to around 6,000. And then I'm also going to do the wet automation. Now, again, here's an example of where if I have these parameters mapped to my controller, which you can do, and I didn't do it for all of these things here, you can do multiple things simultaneously. Here, I'm just going to do them in 2 single passes. But the idea is that to automate them is exactly the same process. There's nothing unique to it. You just have to enable automation on this track. So we'll come over here. We'll go into write mode. Let's go ahead and play this back. And the first step, again, I'm going to slowly and then gradually increase, slowly and then gradually. I'm going to gradually and then rapidly increase the decay. Here we go. Okay. If we play that back, we should see that happening. Okay, and you saw how it went back from 2,000 to 7,000. And then the last part of that is we need to increase the wet signal. So here we go. Okay. And by the way, you see that auto match is working on there, how it's going back to the default position of 44.6 about 1/3 of a second after I let go. All right. And maybe while I'm at it, I'll decrease the dry signal over time as well. Okay. So now when we play it back in context, right, it just adds a little bit more dimension there. We don't need it carrying on too much because it's a cutaway, but it's still lingering there sonically. And maybe, while we're at it, maybe we do a little volume lift there too. Oh, whoops, I think I moved the wrong one. Let's do this again. Okay, now that might be way too much, but let's just take a listen now. Oh, it kind of worked, actually. Okay. You have to experiment. Okay. So once again, if I wanted to modify that, maybe it's too hot, maybe it's too loud, maybe it's too this. Notice by default also, again, just a few keyframes here to manipulate. I could say, all right, instead of going to +5.4, maybe we go down to around +3.2, just crescendo. We could actually move where the crescendo happens as well. If you didn't catch the timing perfectly, right? So we want it to be at full volume right before that last right there. So maybe just around 4.3 dB, okay? Something like that. And then if I wanted to say manipulate, again, one of the signals that we modified, take a look here, look for the asterisk. It tells us that we modified decay and we modified the wet output level, all right? So in this case, if we wanted to adjust, say, the wet output level, now we see that represented in purple. And again, because of that linear point thinning and adjusting that time, notice it's not too many keyframes, all right? If we had that set to 100 milliseconds, there'd be twice as many keyframes here for that little simple curve, which would be just too many to manipulate. And as I pointed out before, by the way, you can also spline these. So if you want this to be not linear, but a bit more Bezier sinusoidal type, we can spline those curves, all right? You also have the ability here to just delete all your selected keyframes or select all of your keyframes, which can be useful, again, sometimes if you're just doing a mass operation here. But real simple, real flexible, and easy to see. And again, as you show the envelopes or the various parameters, it's going to start adding them to the view here. And this is why, again, you're selecting decay, output level, volume level, because it can get real confusing over time, and it's displaying all of them as you enable them. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so a little bit on sound design, a little bit on parameter automation, track automation, volume and pan automation. Similarly, when you're in the Premiere side, when you're doing automation, it's the same concept here. Read, latch, touch, write, same parameters, same concept, same things work with your effects parameters. Okay, so let's talk now a little bit about, we're going to do a little bit of a quick surround automation piece, and then broadcast safe audio export, finalizing, and then we'll call it a Friday, all right? So here I have this surround version of our film here. And as I mentioned, you can perform the automation, everything that I just showed you on the Premiere side. Now, where Audition really, I think, benefits in terms of just having a bit more flexibility in space is largely in 5.1 surround automation. And the reason being is that you just have way more real estate. Because when you're modifying the position of things in multi-channel surround here in Premiere, the issue is you're doing all of it inside of this little box right here. I mean, that's it. You're moving inside of that little box. So it's just not a lot of space. And I personally, I feel just a little cramped when I'm working in that view. So it's entirely up to you, but you get the idea. So similarly, if I wanted to say, take this ascending string track, and we want to start moving this in surround space. Everything's okay here? Yeah, cool. We're going to go into write mode. All right. And now up at the top here, you'll see that we have our little puck. As a former product manager called it, the puck and dish. So if we go ahead and wind back, and I play this back, and I start moving this, all right, and again, wind back here. Notice it goes into touch mode, just like Audition, and pay attention. So you can see the little orb moving. Right. My only issue there is that that's just you're working in that very small space, okay? Very, very small space. And again, you have the option to see all of your keyframes data here. That part of it, the editing part in Premiere, is not so different. It's just working in this little view right here that I just don't particularly love, just because you're really confined to this little square. So if we were to take this, and let's do what we were talking about before. Let's edit the whole sequence over. We'll call this SH Surround, FB1. We'll do the entire sequence, dynamic link, audio handles, transfer everything, effects, volume and pan automation, okay. Click all right. Click all right. Wouldn't that be cool if you actually saw an all right button? Okay, so here now inside of Audition, once again, we have a window here called our track panner, all right? So I'm going to open up the track panner, which you can actually see here. And this is, again, why I love doing this in Audition, because you just have so much more screen real estate to do that. So if we were to go into the same ascending strings, all right, here. And notice, however, though it kept us in touch mode. That's kind of neat. Now you have this to work with, which, by the way, visually also just gives you a better idea of how much sound is actually going to each of those channels. So again, if you're doing surround automation, you can always bounce this stuff back to Premiere. But I really love the way that this works. Now you'll also notice here, You've got discrete settings, not unlike Premiere, for how much is going to the center. So usually by default, I pull this out unless it's dialogue. And then how much is going to the LFE channel, which is your sub channel standing for low frequency effects. By default, that's at 0. Something like these strings, they're fairly high frequency, mid-high frequencies. We don't need to send anything down to the LFE in any case, all right? And you'll also notice I've got my multi-channel audio meter here. So now, in the same way, if I wanted to take these strings and just start manipulating them while in touch mode, let's go and take a listen here and do this. Okay, so now when we play this back again, sorry, I didn't have the clip selected. Sorry about that. So you couldn't see it happening. Here we go. Okay, so again, same concept here. We did our automation. You've just got more screen real estate to see what you've done. And now when we go into our show envelopes, you can see that we modified pan angle and radius. So once again, it'll show envelopes for that. This is another example of where I'd probably thin these keyframes out even more. Like that's way too many, okay? You can see it's doing some extreme jumps there. So again, you can modify this. It's a pretty awesome way to work to get sort of granular. But there's a lot of keyframes there. All right. Similarly, if we were to go into, that was the pan angle, pan radius. Yeah, I mean, it's just too many. It's too many notes, too many keyframes. So this is really even still too many. So I'd probably go up to 500, 600, 700 for that minimum interval time thinning setting. Okay. All right. So that's a little bit of surround automation here. Again, functions the same, but you just have a little bit more space to play around with. Now, at this point, what we might consider doing is actually performing our final mix. So there's a couple different ways that you can mix things down here. And we can do this by mixing everything directly to the finished master and back into Premiere, or we can just export the audio and then finalize the audio and send that back to Premiere, and or we can finalize the audio and put it back into a track in the multitrack and mute everything else, or we can use some of our monitoring tools to actually modify the mix before we mix it down to make it broadcast safe. Because ultimately what we're wanting to do is deliver audio that meets with sort of current standard loudness standards, okay? So if we wanted to do it live without mixing down an individual file that we're going to play with, let me go ahead and just put these back together. You can use something like our multiband compressor. And basically what I'll often do, if I'm going to do it this way, and I don't often use this effect for that, but I bypass all of the compression bands. So I don't want to compress anything in this case, all right? Let's just say everything's mixed the way I want. Typically in mastering, you would do a multiband compressor pass, but we're not doing that right now. If you want to do that, I would highly recommend something like the broadcast preset, which is actually quite subtle and just kind of does a very subtle amount of multiband compression with some fairly standard crossover points. So you can see we're controlling 0 to 137, so all of your lows and kind of the beginning of low mids, 137 to 1K, low mids and mid, 1K to 6K, that's right in that sort of vocal range, and then 6K to 24K, all right? So we can go into something like the broadcast slider, broadcast preset, and then I want to turn on this brick wall limiter. I want to make sure that this is enabled. I'm going to set my margin, which is your digital ceiling. Now, again, based on where this is going, this can vary. Anything that I'm typically sending to YouTube, I'll set the margin anywhere from -1 to minus, sometimes even as much as -3, depending upon how loud and how sort of full the mix is. You don't want to go too low on this unless, again, everything is broadcast standard, because it's going to affect, again, how loud it is when played back on YouTube. Now, YouTube, of course, hasn't implemented all those standards yet. But if you're going to Netflix or something like that, or any kind of broadcast television, you need to be mindful of these things. Regardless, we still need to make sure that we're not kind of overdoing it. So Threshold, let's set this at around -4. Margin, -1.1. Leave everything at the defaults. All right, so we are not going to clip. We're not going to go hit that 0 mark, which is what we're using that broadcast limiter for. Now, again, if you're wanting to finish everything here and be done with it and ensure that you're within safe legal broadcast limits, on the multitrack output here, and I would recommend putting this on and then taking it off, we have something called the Loudness Radar Meter. Now, you've got this in Premiere Pro as well. And what this is going to let you do, based on whatever standard it is that you're working towards. So here in the US, it would be the ITU RBS 1770-3 standard, which I think is our default in any case. Or we can go to something like the EBU standard, all of which, of course, is measured in LUFS. Oh, and this is interesting right here, loudness tips and tricks. That must be new in our latest update. Oh, how fun. Okay. You can see that it's actually conforming to the BS 1770 standard, measured in LUFS. For the European Broadcast Union, that's -23 LUFS is the target limit. Again, all of these other things are set based on the standards for that particular broadcast region. When we go ahead and play this back, we want the average loudness to be represented around -23. And if it isn't, then we need to make changes to the actual mix. So let's take a listen again and see what this starts doing. Okay, so right away, the mix is too hot, okay? So we can do a number of things to combat that. Now again, if we're using our multiband limiter here, first of all, I can back off on the threshold so that we're not giving it any additional boost. And I will drop the margin as well. And you can see that we're still too hot. We're about 3 dB outside of the legal range. So what that really means is now, well, we could do a couple of things. We can also adjust output gain here if we kind of like the way this is overall sounding. So we can drop the output gain. But it also might mean that you need to make some tweaks to the actual mix here. And by the way, if you're doing this, I recommend having this open while you're mixing. The whole time. You can have this on a separate monitor or docked somewhere, just so that you can see this panel to always be checking your mix. This is still showing our, here, let me reset it. I don't know why that isn't resetting by default. Showing our, there we go. So now it looks like we're perfectly within range. In fact, we're maybe even a little quiet, but certainly within legal limits. So we don't have to stress. And at this point, we could deliver this with confidence knowing that this falls within the EBU broadcast standard. -23 point something right there. We're good to go. Sound effects. Okay, see, so I went a little aggressive there. It's a little hot, you know? So again, you can make these changes in real time before you mix. And then directly here from Audition, we can go export back to Premiere Pro, which will allow us to do 3 things. We can either send back individual stems, which is actually what we have in this project here. This represents, in fact, all of the stems with all of their pre-mixed effects here. That is not what we would want. We would more likely want a mixdown, either in stereo or 5.1 or both, okay? The original, the surround version, we'd send back a mixed 5.1 file, which we could then place back in the timeline, which it would do for you, place in the 5.1 mix, and finish it there. you can do that. However, you also have the option to export to Adobe Media Encoder. So that means you're actually finishing everything right here, okay? There's no reason not to just finish it right here, as it is. Now, if you're doing that, of course, then everything, your picture is locked, your sound is ready to go, you're done. This is the same as exporting directly from Premiere. So this is a really nice option to have because, again, it just gives you a lot of flexibility. Now, if you don't want to do your sort of mixing, your mastering and finishing on the master channel, which most people like to take a finished stereo mix and then actually master it, this is typically the workflow for trailers as well, you'll perform an actual mixdown. And to do that, we're going to go to File, Export, Mixdown, Entire Session. All right. Now, let's go in here and let's place this on our, let's go to desktop here. All right. It's a nice long name. We have all of our various options here. Okay. So here's our Wave PCM. All right. And we can go into our various format settings. So again, we're typically going to keep this 32-bit float. If you need to go or convert, you will do that afterwards. So we're going to keep this always in the highest bit depth possible until we get to our waveform view. Okay. Now, once again, you've got some mix down options. You can choose whether we're doing stereo, stems. If we had any bust tracks, we could do that as well. If there's any markers or things in there that we'll need, all those markers can be saved. That's what the include markers and other metadata checkbox is for. All right. And of course, you want to export to an uncompressed file format, which in this case is Wave PCM. So let's go ahead and click OK on this. All right. And it's going to do its mixdown. Hopefully quickly. Is it already done? Oh my God, it's already done. So here we have the final mix. And you can see that we've got some real hot sections here that are like exceeding 0 dB. So this is where we're going to use something that we talked about last week, which is some of our analysis tools, okay? And as we take a look here, we can actually see that our peak amplitude is well above 0. Now, the reason we're even able to do that is because we're working in this 32-bit floating point environment. Now, if we simply wanted to just take this mix and bring all of those out-of-band peaks back into legal range before mastering, the best way to do that is to go into Normalize and simply normalize down. Let's normalize to around minus 0.5. Now, again, this is not the finished master. This is just to bring everything back. What I'm trying to show you here is that you'll notice that there's no distortions on this, right? It's all still there, right? We just have to bring it back within range. So let's go ahead and apply this. And you'll see now our waveforms look nice and healthy. They're just no longer exceeding that 0 dB range. If we go ahead and scan again inside Amplitude Statistics, you can now see that we're okay and there's no clipped samples. Again, if we undo before, scan the selection, you can see clipped samples, right? Go ahead and redo. Now we're back within limits, and it's really just this last little bit right here. It'll even show you, where the peak is, okay? You can see it's right, those 2 points right there. All right. Now, if we want to tame these ahead of time, again, this is where using limiting and compression to kind of tame these out-of-band peaks before we begin mastering, all right? So we might very well do that. But more importantly, let's just say that this mix is exactly where we need it. But now we just want to ensure that this conforms to the broadcast standard before we deliver. And by the way, this is very dynamic. If you were mixing a trailer, again, you're going to use mastering, you're going to use compression and limiting to really even this out. It's a bit too audibly dynamic for a trailer, too much quiet and loud. I like a crescendo, but audiences today typically just want it a bit more in your face sort of all the time. What we can do is we can leverage something called the Match Loudness Panel. And here inside of Match Loudness, we can take this mixdown file. All right, let's just go ahead and save our change there. And we can drag it into the Match Loudness panel, which, by the way, you'll be able to find under the window menu again. You can see that we are in the Match Loudness panel. And what this does is it automatically analyzes all of the attributes of this file, including its current ITU loudness, which at -19 is not within legal broadcast limits, total RMS, the actual peak, the true peak, which is a direct relation to, again, the loudness units relative to full scale. And then these are some of our legacy values, loudness and perceived loudness, which is an RMS value measured in decibels relative to full scale. So down below, you'll see that you got a couple of cool options here. Now, what I love about this is that you can do a number of things with this. First of all, if you simply want to match the loudness to a specific file, you can do that. So you can say, oh, I've got this reference file, make this as loud as this or whatever, okay? This is a great thing. This is a great thing even if you're not doing broadcast safe loudness, but if you have a bunch of songs or a bunch of tracks that you want to match their actual loudness value, you can match it. So like, here is a mix that I love. Make this as loud as that. This will do that, okay? This will do that. However, we want to conform to our, in my case, US broadcast loudness, which is going to be -20. Is it 24 or 23? I always forget what it is, the ITU. Hold on, what's the EBU? EBU is 23. Okay, so ITU is 24. So we're going to go to -24 LUFS. All of these other settings here are the standard based on this loudness standard. Here you can see by default it has this checkbox enabled to use true peak limiting. So this is going to be enabled by default. Let's go ahead and run this. So we're going to run the process. Boom. And it's done. Okay. And you can see before where it was measured at approximately -16 LUFS. Now, with it readjusted, you can see that we are now within the ITU broadcast range here. And if we rescan this, here you can see again, -24 LUFS. So we are now perfectly within legal US broadcast limits for this mix. And what I could do is I could bring this mix back into the multitrack here, right? Place it on a new track, mute everything else, and then know that I'm safe. So I could just right click here, new stereo audio track. All right, take that mix down, drag it in there. All right. And here's where we could actually just solo this. So this is the only track playing. All right, go back to our video here. All right. This is where I could get my meter. All right. And we can watch this. We're verifying to make sure that it doesn't go above that -24. It all looks good. Okay. And so on and so forth, okay? And then complete the process. Again, we could then go through our media encoder export, or we could just export back to Premiere, or we could simply go over to Premiere and import the file here into this master, and then from Premiere, we can go into export media, all right? So you've got a lot of different options, a lot of different ways to get back. To be honest, lately, I've really gotten into the habit of just finishing right here in Audition, never even going back to Premiere, because now we have the ability to do that. So, matching loudness, conforming to broadcast standards, mixing back down to Premiere Pro in 5.1, stereo, or mono. Basic sound design techniques using clip time stretching, different stretching methods, monophonic, polyphonic, and vary speed. Using delay-based effects to create, again, dimension and space, also to take some of the edge off of gritty resampling, or sometimes just to be used to augment kind of dirty sound design. We talked about the analog delay settings, using feedback and trashing those delays, talked about using the phaser, talked about using automation for volume, for pan, and then for individual parameters on the effects that you use. And then lastly, just the ability to either match the loudness to a specific reference file, or using our real-time loudness radar meter to monitor how loud your program is before you export, before you finalize, to ensure that it won't get bounced back to you when you deliver your final master, whether it's via a ProRes file or a DCP file or something else. You'll know with confidence that this can be broadcast legally, and you'll be good to go. So thanks so much for watching. Thank you for tuning in. I hope everyone has a great weekend wherever you are in the world, and we will see you again next time. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.